So here we are with several prepared examples of resolving the 2-7 chord, both in root position and in inversions here. What I've done is I've set up scenarios for each inversion of 2-7. So root position here, first inversion, second inversion, then down here I have third inversion. And I want to show you how they work in both major and minor contexts. So what I've done is I've set up examples in major, and then I've set up examples in the parallel minor as well, just so we can see some of the similarities and differences in how these resolutions work. Okay, so let's just jump right into the first example in the resolving the 2-7 chord in root position in the key of A. So here we go. Here is my one chord, of course, in the key of A, because I also want to show you how kind of we can voice lead into the 2-7s as well. So in this example, I've got a 1 chord going to a 6 chord, right? So just kind of prolonging the tonic there. And then now I'm going to go to this 2-7, to this predominant harmony. Okay, so because it's predominant, that's how I know it's going to resolve to a dominant chord. Either it's going to go to a 5 chord, maybe a 5-7 chord. It could potentially go to a diminished 7 chord or one of its inversions. It could certainly go to a 5 chord, but on the way pass through the cadential 6-4, much as we talked about before. So let's go ahead and just take one option in terms of how I could do this. So a 2-7, let's go ahead and just kind of go straight forward. Let's just take it right on to a 5 chord, okay? Because that'll help us out with, kind of figure out some of the simplicity of these things. So I know that it's going to be an E major chord, right? So the bass will go right to the root there, okay? Before I get much farther, let's go ahead and take a look at the members of the chord that I have present, or the 2-7 chord rather. So here's the root of the 2-7 chord in the bass, the B there. The tenor has the 5th of the chord. It's an F sharp, which it sustained from the previous harmony. Okay, and the soprano, I've got, in the alto, I've got a D, and that's serving as the chordal 3rd. And then in the soprano, I have the chordal 7th. Now, a couple of interesting things about the chordal 7th with respect to 2 chords. Notice how it's actually the tonic key. It's the first scale degree, right? But in this case, in the case of 2-7 and its inversions, it's, it's the chordal 7th. Well, just as we discussed in 5-7, the chordal 7th must resolve down, which is interesting because even though in this case it's the tonic of the key, it still has to resolve down, right? So it has to find its way over to G sharp, okay? Making it the 3rd of the 5 chord, all right? So I've got the chordal root, I've got the chordal 3rd. If I can, I want to go ahead and double the root of the chord, and it turns out that if I take the chordal 3rd here from 2-7 and move it up, now I've got a doubled root, okay, with the bass. So the only thing left now is the 5th, right? So where's that 5th going to go? Well, I can put the 5th right here in the tenor by having the tenor jump up a 5th. Now, jump up a 4th. Now, I could do it that way, but watch what's happened here. What I've done is I've taken a 5th interval here, and I've moved it to another 5th interval between the same 2 voices, right? So I've created a parallel 5th. So I've got to redo that voicing, okay? So let's go back. Let's dial back as far as I can. Now, it really turns out that the only voices I can negotiate with are, in this case, the alto and the tenor, right? Because the bass is committed. It's got to go to the 5th, to the root of the 5 chord. The soprano is committed because it's the chordal 7th. It must resolve down. Okay, so by doubling the root in the alto on the way to this 5 chord, I'm actually going to have some voice leading problems later on, right? So what if instead I take the alto down to a B, and then I take the tenor down to an E and have the tenor double the root instead? Well, now I've got good voice leading into that 5 chord. Okay, so just to confirm, let's go ahead and see how this sounds. So we'll get the key of A major in our ears here. So here's the 1 chord I have, going to 6, okay, 2-7, and now my 5, very smooth voicing. And of course I could finish it off if I wanted to by putting a 1 there. So as I go next door to the parallel minor, what I've done is I've taken essentially the same notes and I've just adjusted them from A major to A minor. But it turns out when I do that, I've actually got a problem. If you can see what I've got circled here in the bass, I'm showing the leap between the F natural in the bass to the B. Well, back in minor, when it was an F sharp to a B, no problem. It was just a perfect fourth, right? And those kinds of jumps, especially in the bass, are no problem at all. But by making this an F natural to a B, what I now have is something we really don't want to see in good voice leading. I've got a tritone leap. So it turns out that this same pattern of voice leading doesn't necessarily travel the same way in minor as it does in major. So I've got to figure out another way to kind of get myself to this 2-7 chord, okay? So here's what I'll do. I'll go back to the drawing board a little bit. I'll erase this. And maybe what I can do, just for simplicity's sake, rather than going to a 6th chord, because I've got a little bit of freedom right now, right? No one ever said I had to go to a 6th chord. Maybe what I'll do instead is I will just go to a variant of my 1 chord. I'll just go to, how about a 1-6? Okay, so that's just going to put the bass here. That means that tenor can't go to an F anymore, right? So maybe I'll just kind of keep the tenor where it was on the E. Okay, which means it's no longer tying into an F. So now I've got a 1-6 chord, but I've got a double third. It'd be great if I didn't have to do that, if you could see up in the alto there. So what I'll do is I'll just really execute a voice exchange between the bass and the alto. So I'll take the alto down to an A, which has just been abandoned by the bass. Meanwhile, the bass went from A to C, which was now going to be abandoned by the alto, right? So it's the same chord, I just kind of recolored it and changed the inversion. Okay, so now the voice leading actually works a little bit better for us. Okay, so I've got a 1 chord going to a 1-6 chord, and then that takes us to a 2-7. Okay, so let's see how we can resolve this. Now, once I'm at this 2-7, I actually could do the very same thing I did back here in the major and go straight to 5. But as I said, on my way to 5, I could go to a cadential 6-4. So let's see how that would work. So a cadential 6-4 would have the bass go again from B to E, because remember the cadential 6-4 is just a fancy 5 chord, right? So it goes to E there. I'll bet you anything I can probably double that, double the bass note in the tenor the same way I did back in my 5 resolution. Remember, when a 6-4 chord, we're going to double the 5th of that chord, right? And because the C6-4 is spelled like a 1 chord, that means the 5th is, of course, the note I have in the bass. So that's why I'm doubling the tenor there, okay? And so now the alto, instead of jumping down to a B, let's have it pass first through a C, okay? And the soprano, even though the soprano is the chordal 7th, and it does need to eventually resolve down, for the purposes of a cadential 6-4, I can actually sustain that pitch here, okay? So now a cadential 6-4, and from there, I can go actually to the very same 5 chord I resolved to back in the major. Okay, so let's see what that sounds like. Here I go in the minor key. Let's just give us a sense of A minor. All right, so here's the 1 chord I have written. My voice exchange into the 1-6. And then the 2-7, cadential 6-4 to 5. And then, of course, if I wanted to, I could either leave that as a half cadence or just voice lead it on over to 1. So here it is again without my narration. So now we'll take a look at the 2-6-5 chord, which actually, in my experience at least, tends to be a more common setting of the 2-7 chord when used as a predominant chord. You'll see it in first inversion more frequently, I think, than you'll see it in some of the others. Okay, so here we go with one of those typical resolutions, 2-6-5. To 5, we can also do 2-6-5 to cadential 6-4. Since we did a cadential 6-4 in minor with 2-7, let's start with a cadential 6-4 in major for the 2-6-5. Okay, so here we go. Cadential 6-4 means that I'm going to have the 5th scale degree in the bass, which is conveniently enough just to step up, okay, from where the bass is here. It means I'm going to double the bass. So what I can do is I can look around and figure out which note is closest which of the remaining three voices at least is closest to another F. Okay, it turns out that the alto looks like a pretty good candidate, right? Because it's just a step away from the F. And this looks pretty promising because what I've done is I've approached an octave from opposite directions, right? So in contrary motion. So I'll bet I can work with that, okay? So now what I'm going to need is I'm going to need the tonic pitch, right? So the first scale degree, and I'm going to need the third, okay? So well, it turns out the tenor's already got that first scale degree sitting right there, so there's no reason I can't just kind of carry the B flat right on over, okay? And then I'll put the third in the soprano. Okay, so a C6-4, remember, cadential 6-4 is just a harbinger or just a precursor to 5. So we never want to just kind of leave it there. So for the sake of completion, I'll go ahead and continue that off to a 5 by sustaining the bass, sustaining the other, the doubling of the bass, and then resolving the other ones down, right? Because remember, that's what a cadential 6-4 is. The what looks like the chordal root of the one chord, right? And the chordal third of that chord, they're really just upper neighbors, right? Which can, in this case, move on down to give us a completed 5 chord, okay? So let's get a sense of what that sounds like. Here's the key of B flat major for us, which actually is almost exactly what I've got voice leading here. Okay, so here I go. Okay, then I can resolve it if I wanted to. Okay, so this is an acceptable way. It's an okay way to resolve this. Listen to it again. So in terms of the voice leading, it's actually okay. The one problem I guess I kind of have with this one is you end up with a bit of a sing-song thing happening in the soprano, right? Which is the voice which really should have the most interesting melodic activity. But here it's just kind of, seesawing back and forth between D and C. So for me, that might be a reason to go ahead, in this case, abandon the cadential 6-4 as much as I love it, and just voice lead everything right on over to 5, which works, pretty darn well here, okay? So in this case, it would sound like... Okay, so there's a little bit less of that indecision in the soprano. We just carry the C over as a common tone from the 2-6-5. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at the parallel version of this. Remember, before we found voice leading issues that arose when we moved from major to minor. We don't have the same kind of things, at least built into the way that we've started this chord. Okay, but I do want to point something out here that's really exciting about looking at 2-6-5 in minor, which in this case is, of course, a half diminished chord. Because it's half diminished, you know that the underlying triad of the 2 chord, it includes a diminished fifth. Well, diminished fifth, of course, is another name for tritone. So when you're using a 2-7 chord in minor keys, realize that you actually have a tritone, which if we want, we can give a nice resolution here. Just like I train myself to do with 5 chords, I find my tritone, okay? So I've got a tritone between the G flat and the C. Okay, so in this case, it's an augmented fourth. And if I can, I would like to resolve that tritone by contrary motion. It isn't always necessary to do when it's not the 5 chord, but sometimes if I can get away with that, I'd like to. Okay, so if I were to do that, this is written as a diminished fourth, which means that it's actually going to resolve, it's going to expand out. So if I'm going to resolve that tritone, the way I'll do it here is I'll bring the alto here, and I'll bring the soprano back to a D flat, right? So it's a D flat back here, okay? And this is starting to look a lot like that cadential 6-4 chord that I had here, okay? So I could then keep the B flat here in the tenor, just like I did before, move the bass up to here, and then have a cadential 6-4. All right, so now, like back in the major when we did this, we had kind of that sing-songy soprano, and we're probably going to get the same thing here, right? But I'm just kind of showing you that by resolving the tritone, going to a C6/4 is usually a pretty nice thing to do. And you can do that because it, the melodic motion in the voice isn't always what we have here. It just kind of worked out that way this time. Okay, so if I were to continue through with that, then I would resolve to a 5. Make sure I put a natural there, not because it wouldn't be natural anyway. I just train myself whenever I'm dealing with leading tones to go ahead and mark it, in minor keys at least. Okay, so let's hear what that sounds like in B minor. Here's the key. And here's my voice leading. And then I can resolve it to 1 if I want. Okay. All right, so that's the 265. So in the previous resolutions of 2/7, I've shown how we can resolve them to a 5 chord as a triad, or to cadential 6/4, which of course leads us to a 5 chord. So here I'll show how we can also resolve to a 5/7 chord. Okay, so I've arrived at a 2/4/3 in the key of C sharp major here, and my goal is to take myself to a 5/7. Okay, well, I think at this point what I'll do is I'll just kind of take an inventory of the notes that I'm going to need, so I can kind of pull out my old law of the shortest way trick. So for a 5/7 chord, I'm going to need the root of the chord, which is going to be a G sharp, right? Because it's a 5th scale degree in the key of C sharp major. I'm going to need a chordal third, so that's going to be a B sharp, and that's going to be my leading tone. I'm going to need a 5th, which is D sharp, and then I'm going to need a 7th, which is F sharp. Okay, now watch what happens here. Remember the law of the shortest way. Law of the shortest way says if I can sustain a common tone, let me go ahead and do that. All right, and it turns out that I've got a couple of common tones sitting right here. I've got a D sharp in the soprano, which I can carry over. That takes care of the chordal 5th. I've got an F sharp, which I can carry over from the alto. And look, there's my chordal 7th, which I've approached by suspension. That's a good thing, okay? So 2 common tones here. And really now all I need to do is figure out a G sharp and figure out a B sharp. Well, remember, the bass is committed. The bass has got to voice the root of the chord, okay? And it turns out the B sharp, the leading tone, is only a half step below where the tenor just happens to be here. Okay, so I've got a nice approach to a 5/7 chord. And since I'm looking at a 5/7 chord anyway, I may as well just resolve it to 1. Okay, so the bass will go to C sharp. Now watch this. If I go up to C sharp here, notice how that would cross where the tenor was. So that's easy enough. I'll just have the bass resolve to the lower C sharp. Okay, bass is committed, and remember my nice trick for this is I'm going to go ahead and find my tritone, which is going to involve the leading tone and the chordal, the chordal 7th. Okay, so my leading tone's here in the tenor, chordal 7th is here in the alto. Okay, so tritones all resolve in contrary motion, so the leading tone is going to go up, resolving to C sharp here. Okay, it doesn't look very up, does it? Let me draw a higher ledger line. Okay, up to C sharp there, which means the alto then is going to come down to the E. And then, of course, I'll just bring my 2nd scale degree down to double the root in the soprano. Okay, make sure the E is sharp. And there's a really nice resolution. I mean, it looks like it should sound really good, but remember, music, of course, is made to be heard, not stared at. So let's see what it sounds like. Here's my key of C sharp major. So here I go. There's that 2/4/3, going directly to a 5/7, and then nice 1 chord. Okay, I should amend my label, of course, because in following tritone resolution, that means I've tripled the root of the chord. So I really ought to label this as an incomplete 1 chord. All right, so let me play that example again. One thing I'll point out, I mean, just really look at the really cool melodic bass motion I'm able to create by the use of these chords, right? Both triads and 7th chords, okay? Root position, inversion. I get some really nice stepwise motion in the bass, which is beautifully accompanied by thirds by thirds in the tenor, right, for the majority of the time. So that's just some really smooth writing there, okay? All right, so now here I go. I'm going to do the same, or I'm going to look at the same idea in the minor mode. Notice how I have the 5/6 circled. Let me go back to what I was talking about in the bass. The bass is kind of doing this descending stepwise motion, okay? And it descends through a 5/6 chord. Well, if I had made the 5/6 chord major here, what that would have done is it would have created a leading tone here, which, I mean, it's bad enough that the leading tone wouldn't resolve up. Okay, maybe excusable if it's doing passing motion, except that the B sharp would have created an augmented second to the A, right? So in order to mitigate that, it wasn't too hard. I just wanted to make it a 5/6 chord. And I'm not really destroying much of anything because, you know, this 5/6 chord back here was really ornamental more than functional anyway, so it wasn't really acting as a dominant. Okay, so I can just use this as a similar ornament without affecting too much and also avoiding that augmented second. Okay, so let's go ahead and resolve, do that 5/7 resolution again. Bass has to go here. Okay. I will bring the tenor down to the leading tone, just as I did before. And remember, just as I did in the major, I have common tones in both the alto and the soprano. So let's see how that sounds. C sharp minor. Pretty dramatic. Let's hear it again. And just so you can kind of hear how jarring that augmented second would have been, I'm gonna play that with a B sharp. Right, definitely more exotic, but there's clearly something off about that. Let me do that one more time. So far so good, but then, okay. Which is why we go ahead and smooth out the voice work in the bass by making it be natural. So here we are now with the 2/4/2 or the 2/2 chord. And this is kind of cool. Remember how the chordal seventh of the 2/7 chord is the tonic pitch? Okay, so a really nice way to voice lead into a third inversion 2/7 chord is to just, you know, if you're starting at the 1 chord, just continue that pitch in the bass and you've got the chordal seventh, right? Which is what I've exemplified here. Okay, and remember, because it's the chordal seventh, I've got to resolve it down. So really the 2/2 chord or the third inversion of the 2/7 chord is very likely to resolve to maybe something like a first inversion 5 chord. Okay, so I'll go ahead and try that out. Do a 5 chord in first inversion. Okay, which means the bass is committed, right? Well, both because it's the bass and because it's a chordal seventh, it's got to resolve, in this case, down. All right, so in order to finish off this chord, of course, it's in the key of D major, so a 5 chord in D major has A as the root, C sharp is the third, E as the fifth. Okay, so law of the shortest way. Do I have any of these just kind of sitting around? Okay, well, I have an E here in the alto. I could bring that here. Okay, and then I could double the A by bringing the soprano up and by bringing the tenor down. So that should work, okay? But now, remember, I could also potentially resolve to a 7th chord, right? So if I did that, then maybe what I could do is just go ahead and bring the tenor down as I planned, but then just leave the soprano hanging out on what becomes the chordal 7th, turning this from a 5/6 chord to a 5/6/5 chord, okay? So let's go ahead and play that version of it, since that's the one we're looking at here. Key of D major. So here we go. flat here. All right, and I should have pointed out that I have a common tone in the alto. Okay, let's hear it again. So let's go ahead and go back to the other version I had of this, where I just voice led to a plain old 5/6 chord as a triad. So the only difference being that the soprano, instead of sustaining a common tone and causing a suspension into that chord, went ahead and led its way up. Okay, so here's that version of it. Okay, then I can resolve it to a 1 chord. Both of those work beautifully. Okay, and now in minor, we'll do the same kind of resolution because triads are so cathartic after a 7th chord. Let's go ahead and resolve that to just a good old 5/6, and then we can show the voice leading into 1. Okay, so 5/6 bass has to go to a C sharp, both because the chord is prescribed for us and because it's the chordal 7th. Okay, remember the tenor and the soprano can resolve out to give us our root of the chord, and then the alto holds a common tone. All right, and then we'll go ahead and resolve this the way we've been resolving them. Bass is committed. Okay, either one of these A's I could sustain as a common tone. The other one probably needs to go to the 3rd. Okay, so maybe what I'll do, let me go ahead and solve the alto first, give us a doubling. Okay, and maybe what I'll do is I'll take the soprano to the 3rd, hold a common tone in the tenor. Okay, and I'll show you why I made that choice in just a second, but first let's go ahead and play it as is. Here's D minor. Okay, so here's my 1 chord to a 2 half diminished 2 chord to a 5/6. Here it is again. Okay. So I told you I explained why I decided to bring the soprano down to the F rather than the tenor. I could have done it either way, but this is kind of a fun way of explaining my thinking here. It's not at all uncommon to have a 5 chord as a triad become a 5/7 on the way to resolving 1, or in this case a 5/6/5. Okay, so watch what I can do. I can take the soprano to the A, and then before I leave it, just have it pass through a G on the way to F. So it creates nice, smooth voice leading in the soprano, but it also gives me, coming from the doubling the chordal root here to a chordal 7th, right here. And so that transforms this from being a 5/6 chord, right, to a 5/6/5 chord. And that's one way I can kind of show that transformation between harmonies. Okay, so let's hear it now in this form. And so just if the poor tenor isn't forgotten, I'll play it again, but I'll do the same thing in the tenor. So the soprano is going to hang on to the A this time, and the tenor will give the passing 7th there. Okay, of course, the soprano will probably have to hang out on the A in that case. Okay, so just a nice way to kind of intermingle triads with 7 chords by using what we can call a passing 7th on the way down. So the previous examples illustrate the pretty strong bias of a 2 or a 2/7 chord to go to 5, right, as a dominant 5 or 5/7 maybe going through cadential 6/4. Because of how functional harmony works, with a predominant chord being able to go to a dominant chord, it's technically possible for 2 to go to a 7 chord, a diminished 7 chord in place of 5, but it's pretty tricky to do in terms of the voice leading, and I want to kind of show you what I mean by that in this example here, where I've just taken from the A minor thing that we did a little bit ago, So with the root position 2-7, going to, instead of a 5 chord, going to a 7 diminished 6 chord in this case. So what I've done is, this is essentially just a recast of an example that appears in our textbook on page 238. There's an example that goes from 2-7 to 7 diminished 6. So this is a kind of a revoicing of that example in a different key. So here's what we're going to do. We know we need to create a 7 diminished 6 chord, which is going to be a diminished triad based on the 7th scale degree of A minor. So the members of the chord I'm going to need are G sharp, B for the 3rd, the chordal 5th is going to be D, okay? And so that completes my triad. Now, remember, this is a diminished triad, which means the root to the 5th is going to create that diminished 5th or that tritone, okay? And that's important for doubling, because when I double, I want to make sure I don't double the member of that dissonance. So instead, I want to double the B, okay? So let's see how that would work. First of all, let's see what common tones I have that I can use. It turns out that the D is already present in the alto, so I'll keep that. A B is already present in the bass, so I'll keep that too. And that works because that will take care of the correct inversion as well. Okay, so really I need to find a way to double the B, and I need to get to a G sharp. Okay, well, let's say that I put the G sharp, just as I'm trying to think through things here, let's say that I put that in the tenor, okay, and then I put the B here in the soprano. Well, I've got a problem here, because in the tenor, by putting a G sharp there, what I've done is I've created an augmented second, right? A melodic augmented second here between the tenor and its own voice in the next chord. So I can't do that. So what if I switch it around? What if instead I put the G sharp in the soprano, and then I got to double the B, right? So maybe I put the B in the tenor. Well, unfortunately, I've traded one dissonant leap for another, because now this represents the leap of a tritone. Okay, we like tritones, but we really like to see them harmonically, so between voices, rather than having a tritone leap within a single voice. Okay, so that's not going to work either. So how do we handle this? It's really difficult with all the notes present in the 2-7 chord to voice lead smoothly into the 7 diminished 6. If you look at the example in the book, what they've done is they've actually created an incomplete 2-7 chord. They've done so by, of course, omitting the 5th, and what they've done instead is they've doubled the root of the chord. And that would allow us then to sustain that root to become the nice doubled 3rd here. Okay? Now, here's where this gets a little dicey, right? Because as soon as I see a 2 half diminished 7, I know that the root of the chord is going to create a diminished interval, a diminished 5th, with the 5th of the chord. So isn't it true that I'm not supposed to double the root of a diminished triad or diminished chord? Well, that's true, assuming a 5th is present. Look at how we got to that. Look at how we got to this B. We did so by eliminating the chordal 5th altogether. Right? So now we see another example of some of the flexibility lent to us by incomplete chords. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and I'll play this example. I won't play it in the context of the beginning of the A minor passage, just because other notes are going to have to change in terms of the voice leading in order to arrive at this B here in the tenor. So I'll just kind of tonicize A minor for us. Okay, and in this case I've worked my way to this 2-7 chord, taking it to a 7-6. So that's one example of how you can resolve a 2-7 chord to a 7-6 using as our dominant there. But really, it's much smoother, much safer, much easier to handle smooth voice leading by taking the 2-7 in whatever form it appears in, major or minor, root position or inverted, taking that to a 5 chord of some kind.